Right.
Okay, great. It is recording. Let's see. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the Connections Literary Reading Series with author Wayne Karlin. I'm going to introduce Wayne before the reading commences. Uh, Wayne Karlin is the author of 9 novels, a short story collection, and 3 nonfiction books. A professor emeritus at the College of Southern Maryland, Karlin is the recipient of 6 State of Maryland Individual Artist Awards in Fiction, 2 fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Patterson Prize in Fiction, the Vietnam Veterans of American Excellence in the Arts Award, and the Juniper Prize for Fiction. His books have also been published in England and in translation in Denmark, Sweden, Italy, and Vietnam. A Genizah is a storage area in a Jewish synagogue or cemetery designated for temporary storage of worn out Hebrew language books and papers on religious topics prior to a proper cemetery burial. In the novel The Genizah, Wayne Karlin enters its pages as a character in his own novel, reimagining his family's lives and fate if they had not come to America but stayed in his mother's village in Poland, where the rest of her extended family were murdered by the Nazis in 1941. Karlin commemorates and mourns that unutterable loss by making it present in the spirit of the words from the Passover Seder, which asks those at the table to recount the story of oppression as if they had lived it. How can anyone who's not lived it understand the Holocaust or the terrible massacres of our own times, whether in Charleston or in Israel or in Gaza, sparked by hatred of the other? Karlin's answer to that question is to personalize the impersonal, to feel, not just to know what happened, as good fiction allows us to do. One of the most poignant moments of the novel for me was the description of Rahel's new trade, making custom hats. The narrator tells us the hats made to her specifications had sold well in Warsaw and other large cities, and Waxel had paid her for more designs. She loved the sense of creating something beautiful from what first seemed like random, disconnected pieces of nothing. She liked making money from it also, the idea of making money doing work she loved as a new notion. She dreamed of having her own hat factory, one day perhaps. Her dreams quivered fragilely over a sea of nightmares. This passage made me think about how news stories about mass death have become so common that it can become so easy to find ourselves desensitized to the numbers. But in this moment, we're reminded that Rahel, who by now we know and love, represents 6 million others whose talents, hopes, and dreams were obliterated by the Nazis. We're able to find comfort knowing that the real Rahel made it out of Poland in time, but the very real ache in our hearts remains for those who did not. I first met Wayne Karlin here at CSM when I took his creative writing class in the spring of 2004. Since then, for the past 20 years, I've seen Wayne as a guiding light in both my writing and my teaching, and I'm honored to have him with us here today.
Thank you, Krista.
Hi, Wayne. So I wanted to first ask you about this this definition that you have here of the Genizah. What is the relevance of the Genizah in this novel?
It has to do really with how the novel came to being. In the first chapter, the me character finds a Genizah in an abandoned Jewish school in New York City, and that's something it's fictionalized in a novel, but it actually did happen to me. Where I was visiting such a place, I changed it, made it happening more contemporarily, but it actually happened years ago.
Mm.
And that the thing is that I'd gone to the town my mother came from in Poland in the 1990s, where over 2,000 Jews had been slaughtered there, machine gun in ditches. And one of the things that I took away from that trip was that real anger that their presence had been erased. I mean, that had been largely a Jewish town before the Holocaust, and within weeks they had all been massacred. and their presence had just been erased. So that image of their stories, the words being walled up, behind a wall, and then in the darkness, and the need to bring the stories out, to somehow commemorate the stories, to break it out of the walls of the Genizah where they're buried.
So, and bring their stories into the light.
Yeah.
In this, so you say here, there's a quote that says, in each generation, each person is obligated to see himself or herself as though he or she personally came forth from Egypt. Can you talk a little bit about that quote?
That's from the Passover Haggadah is the book you read at the Passover table, and it tells the story of the Jews being enslaved in Israel and then liberated, and the Exodus. And you're called upon to see, as you speak about it, as you remember, you're called upon not to talk about it as if it happened to them, but as if it happened to you. And in a way, that's what fiction does. I mean, you imagine yourself into the life of somebody else in order to have that experience. So I mean, in the Passover, you're being asked to experience something, both terrible and wonderful. You're being asked to experience slavery and oppression and liberation. With the book, I wanted to personalize the abstract horror of what had happened in my mother's town and what had happened in the Holocaust, all together. I wanted to make it something that, in a way, it's something that I wanted to personalize for myself, but it's also something that I wanted to personalize for readers, in the way that fiction can.
Yeah, and you do such a beautiful job of that, to the point where I very much was rooting for them to make it out, even though the story is based on your grandmother, your mother, and your uncle, who actually did leave Poland. It's based on them had they not left.
Yeah.
And in the story, well, and your father as well. So those four people having stayed in Poland, what I thought was really beautiful is that your parents, who in real life met in New York, you have them meeting in Poland. It had this like sort of meant to be quality that it gave me so much sort of hope for things to be okay for them. But I think I could sense, of course, because I know what happened in Kolno, I think I kind of knew that it wasn't going to be okay.
Yeah.
And so definitely, and that quote that I read in the intro about Rahel's like hopes and dreams of having her own hat factory. I think that that personalization, that small detail, I just found so incredibly poignant and really heartbreaking to think about. It's not just a number. It's when you think about mass death, it's every single person. With them goes all of their hopes and dreams. So this next quote, it's a Tim O'Brien quote. Can you talk about the significance of this quote in the writing of the novel?
Yeah, and I'll just say, to add on to what you were saying, that idea of imagining this happening to my parents was the way to personalize it for me. The way to really make that personal. And that, the Tim O'Brien quote, he uses the word, I mean, save can have so many different meanings, right? It means, in the story, he's talking about saving the memories, saving the lives of people by telling their stories, because, our lives are made up of stories. So for me, to go back to that idea of the way those people had been erased, the way my family had been erased, just gone. You go to that town, and it's pretty and there's nothing there. The cemetery has been pretty much desecrated. It's just a weedy field. So the stories save them, in that way.
Hmm.
Maybe we can come out of the slides now and
Sure.
yeah,
There we go.
come out of them.
Oh, do you see the slide?
Yeah, it's still up there.
Gotcha. And oh, do you want me to go to the next one?
No, just go out of it so we can come back to it.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, so the first portion that you're going to read is from the chapter called Our Voice.
Yeah. And
Okay.
in the that's the second chapter, and then in the first chapter, I have myself going into the Genizah. And the last lines of that chapter read, as I'm pushing in a coffin basically full of books to commemorate them. As I placed the box inside the opening, a pulse leapt in my hands, and I felt a flutter of hard, minuscule wings inside my veins. Behind a sudden veil of tears, I could see the letters rising and dancing like a story that was coming to life to keep the world from flying to pieces. And that goes into the second chapter, our voice. So, Chris, I have you up on the screen.
What do you mean? Sorry.
Okay.
Are you going to read from your chapter?
Yes, I am. Right now.
Okay. Gotcha.
If you could switch the speaker to me for this, maybe.
Oh, I see you on the screen.
Oh, okay, good. I see you.
Yes.
All right.
Okay, gotcha. All right. I think let's see.
I guess it depends on how people are viewing it. So
Yeah, I think everyone has their own view. So they could have it on speaker view, or they could have it on like everyone view. So I think
gotcha.
once you start talking, it'll switch over to you automatically.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. Take it away.
Words scattered from the Genizah like a panic cloud of blackbirds, spread a net against the sky, wove strands of nothing as if a web of faint breaths. If words call the world, can they reform the world as well? The light inside the Genizah flickers, elongates like a candle flame caught in an uncertain wind, dances shadows against the curved wall. On the floor, one book remains. A single gilded word forms onto its black cover, Kuf Lamed Vav Nun. The Hebrew letters dance into place one by one, simultaneously flicking into English letters, Kolno, my mother's town in Poland. I see a folded sheet of paper sticking out from the pages of the book. I take the sheet and unfold it. A list. I've seen it before. The name of the authority that issued it blurs as I try to read it, the way words in a dream are blurred or elusive. But the details in the list can be seen clearly. Our family name, first name, town, country, fate. Brickman, Avraham, Kolno, Poland, murdered. Brickman, Gittel, Kolno, Poland, murdered. 23 names. I know the number without counting, though I'm not certain of the relationship. 23 left behind. Kolno, they whisper from the ditch where their bones lie, still entangled. Their voices, our voice. The word voice in Hebrew is kol. Kolno koleno, my mother would sing, a dimly remembered ditty from her girlhood that Judaized the Polish name to mean our voice. Before the war, most of the town had been Jewish, Yiddish its first language, and Jews not allowed in the Polish school. My mother had studied Hebrew in a Beit Yaakov, a school for Jewish girls. I count the names, touching each one as I do. 26. I count again. 3 extra names have been tagged at the end of the list. Brickman, Sarah Gittel, Kolno, Poland, murdered. Brickman, Yitzhak, Kolno, Poland, murdered. Brickman, Rachel, Kolno, Poland, murdered. My grandmother, my uncle, my mother, all of them who had left that place, found sanctuary in America. 3 lines appear as I touch them. The lines appear as I touch them. Fade to white when I lift my finger. Appear, disappear. Then a 4th line, at first blurry, but sharpening into clarity. Karlinsky, Elazer, Kolno, Poland, murdered. My father, who had never been there. A part of me knows I am creating the dream even as it forms, a lucid dream. But why this dream? Why add these names to that list? Stories can save us, a friend of mine had written, but why this story? I knew they're real stories. In the Lower East Side, near the yeshiva where the words had been entombed in a Genizah, my mother, daughter of Pinchas and Sarah Gittel, had escaped from Europe, then burst herself out of the clinging web of family and into the new world. And my father, a descendant of a rabbinical dynasty, had fled that world and shaped himself into a street fighter and a boxer. Later, he had married an older woman who owned a millinery manufacturing business. She'd become obsessed with him. She picked him like she had chosen a prime brisket from a butcher shop and then sliced him up, my mother always said. Their relationship, she insisted, was unhealthy, strained. And when she came to work for him, they'd fallen in love. He divorced his wife, but the status of the divorce was contested, and he and my mother had gone to Mexico to be married. And as an aside, to stop here, I mean, one reason I put this chapter in is when I get into the chapters where I'm reimagining them in Poland, I had to figure out how to marry them and to, tie that to their real lives. Once I had written the stories my mother told me about her life in Kolno in a weave of dreams, a game of rumors, where a secret is passed down a line of children, whispered from one set of lips to an ear and so on, so that as it travels, it's changed, taking on the truth of each child through whom it passes. So at the end, it's the same, but changed, reinvented, even as America had allowed my mother and our family to not just live, but to reinvent themselves, which is the process of living. I'd written how my grandmother, Sarah Gittel, had been halfway across the Atlantic on her way to America when she removed her Orthodox wig and threw it in the ocean. Then she shook her head rapidly as if waking the crown of real hair she'd allowed to grow secretly under the wig. The hairs on the wig wriggled like the tentacles of a sea creature as it floated on the surface until it soaked in the weight of the water and sank. She watched the disappearing black dot of the hairpiece with a smile that shocked her children, my mother and uncle, as much as the action they had just witnessed. It was a stranger's smile. It threw into doubt the whole country of memory. What if Sarah Gittel and my parents had stayed in Europe? If they'd stayed in Europe to end as lines in a list of murders? If their story had been not one of escapes, but of capture? If they'd been woven into the murder they'd only escape because some in their families had the guts and the luck to twist out of a trap? I knew little of my father's family history. His death when I was 5 had severed me from whatever his stories might have been. But I knew what the end of my mother's story would be if she had stayed in Poland. It had been foreshadowed in the blood that had awakened in helpless echo from her body, her first menstruation that occurred when she had seen the blood of the murdered flowing in the gutters before her house during the pogroms that had rolled through Poland like harbingers of the greater massacre that would happen in 1941. I knew about the ditch of the murdered from which we'd been spared, escaped, but that inevitably extended in my own mind to the ditch in My Lai, in the war to which I had gone. I knew the raw pain of loss, which was the same for one person torn away or for 2,000, the loss that must be held up into the light to find out how it can speak to love. The wig, what if they had never left? The wig flings itself out of the ocean, nestles back onto Sarah Gittle's head. The ship flies in reverse through the ocean, the spray from its wake, arcing down to the water it churns through. She and Rachel and Yitzhak vomited back into Europe, dust flying from wheels and hooves as they are drawn, yanked back to Kolno, to my grandfather's grave, the stones they had placed on his headstone flying back into their hands, flung back on the earth, with their father, their husband, nested in it. Why should they leave Sarah Gittle, demand Sarah Gittle, go to a land of cannibals? They're pulled back to the market square, the river Lavnus boiling black over white rocks that stand like the tombstones that mark the path of life as it veers uncontrollably into oblivion. I'm going to read you some extracts from then the story set in Poland, but before doing that, let me show you some of the actual pictures from Kolno then and now. So this was my grandfather's grave, and my mother and my uncle and her mother. They took this photograph just before they left for America. And when I went back to Kolno in the 90s, it was one thing I tried to visit, but it was gone. And you see the little stones that they put there, which is a Jewish custom of leaving stones when you visit a grave site. And give me a next slide, please. That's my on the right's my father's mother and father. Again, they were this very pious family, and then my mother's father, as they were in Poland. Go ahead, the next one. And this is the transformation of America. This is my mother and father when they're here. My dad, literally grew up on the Lower East Side of New York, tough neighborhood. He became a boxer. This was in a restaurant in New York, I think taken in the 40s sometime. Transformation. Okay, so I'm going to go back to reading a bit here.
I just have one quick follow-up question.
Sure.
On your previous reading, and it's such incredible pictures. I actually didn't realize before that picture of your mother at the gravesite, it's such a beautiful and vivid picture. Like it almost didn't look real. It almost looked like it was like something that was like staged or something. Like it's just so gorgeous. I think that's incredible that you have that picture, because the fact that it has the gravestone's gone. That was just so, but the question I had was, do you think there was any, if there was probably, I'm assuming there's probably some hesitation for your grandmother and your mother and your uncle to leave, your father as well. Do you know if there was hesitation? Did you ever hear about any sort of like, was there a chance that this wasn't going to, be their fate?
I don't think there was much hesitation at all.
Hmm.
I mean,
Because
to get,
of what they had seen, they knew,
yeah,
because of the previous pogrom, they knew what could happen to them.
I knew what had happened. All of my mother's older brothers and sisters had gone ahead of time
Right.
and were there and were, basically year by year, we're bringing people over. Yeah, they it was a fairly miserable life. I mean, I'm sure there were good things and bad things and and the warmth of family and neighborhood and all of that, but it was impoverished, it was segregated, and periodically people would try to slaughter them.
Right.
In that period, I mean, this is before the Holocaust in
Yeah.
Eastern Europe. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews killed in these kind of pogroms. For people who don't know the word, they were these kind of mob riots where people would go into Jewish areas and rape and kill people. And my mother had seen that. Family hidden in a cellar while that was going on, and so I don't think there was much hesitation to leave.
And I imagine, yeah, if you had the opportunity, you would take it. Yeah. And also with family already in America,
Yeah,
probably a whole lot easier. And it's not just going to a new place, but it's, reunifying, with your people. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to mute myself. I'll let you go ahead and read the next section.
okay. So this was one of the older stories that I migrated in the book, and this really happened to my uncle. This was not part of the fictionalized thing, and actually, my uncle showed me his foot at one point. You'll see what I mean. And the chapter is called Dove's Toes. My mother's brother Dove had escaped to America years before when he received word from a comrade who'd infiltrated the secret police that he used to be drafted into the Russian army, a traditional way of getting rid of troublemakers. On a cold winter morning, a few days later, he bared his left foot and placed it on top of a stump behind the house. He looked up at the iron gray sky. Then he looked down at the gnarled stump sticking out from the smooth expanse of snow like something mutilated. Leaning against it was an axe. Second, I have somebody admitting. Dove broke the axe from the frozen grip of the ice, swung it over his head in a hissing arc, and brought it crashing down on the ice in a small trough next to the stump. It took two more blows to break a hole through the thick skin of ice. As soon as he saw the black water welling through, he gripped the axe up high in its handle with his right hand, touched the cold, sharp blade to the area he wanted to hit, brought the axe up, and then swung it down swiftly onto the stems of his two smallest toes. In the instant of the arc, he saw himself frozen like a picture, a lean, intense man swinging an axe, his breath steaming in the air. The instant shattered like a shard of ice. He heard the solid chunk of the axe biting into the wood, felt it vibrate in his palms. He saw bright red blood gouting out onto the white snow. The pain seared up his veins and lumped into throbbing red-hot iron behind his eyes. Lifting his leg with both hands under the knee, he plunged his foot into the hole in the ice, which was already shrinking, then withdrew it. A blister of freezing blood formed around it. He sat on the stump and wrapped his foot in linen, then picked up the two pellets of his toes from the crusted snow. Using the axe for a crutch, limped back to the house. Months later, after he'd been involved in more radical politics and learned he was to be arrested anyway, he left the village. As he walked away, his mother came running down the road after him, holding the linen packet, screaming after him to take his toes. to take her, that he would need them both in America. I guess, I mean, one thing I'd point out with that, so I know you're doing this for your literature class also, that, you know, in the writing of fiction, that's what you do. I mean, that actually happened. I'm fictionalizing by putting myself into his perception. You know, how would that feel like? What would he look like when, you know, he's going to cut off his toes, excuse me. I mean, I put in that gnarled, the stump. You don't have to say anything about that, but did he connect that in his mind to the toes? You know, it's on. It's part of hope, you know, hoping that you get to experience the scene, you know, through your senses.
And it reminds me of what you were saying about how at the Passover table, you're asked to not just imagine, to put yourself in the shoes of
So, you know,
of your ancestors. And as you said, that's exactly what the best fiction is. It allows you to put yourself into the place of another character, which ultimately, gives you that feeling of empathy, which is so important. And I mean, you did such a great job. I almost wondered if he had actually if he, I, if he had actually sort of described this to you. And it probably would have been. There might not have been a lot of memories attached to that moment for him. It probably would have been a little spotty. It's probably pretty traumatic.
never
Do you
talked
know
about it.
what was
Never
that?
talked about it. He never talked about it, but he did show me his foot.
Yeah, he just showed you the foot. um, did you know if it was in winter? Because I thought that was a really clever part to kind of.
I don't know when it was. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway,
I made it winter.
well,
Powerful.
yeah. If you were to cut
Um,
off your toes, then you would have maybe done it in winter or had some ice nearby. That would have been the smart way. Anyway, I'll let you go ahead and read the next part.
okay. So, I mean, one thing I had to get my parents married in this, if they're in Poland. And that's this scene. And it's, I guess a couple of things you should know. Um, in the Jewish custom, the couple is married under a canopy. And there's one part of the ceremony where there's a glass wrapped in linen, and the bridegroom stomps on it to break it, and that's to remind people of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Okay. So my father's Hebrew name was Eliezer, and the woman, I didn't use the real name of the real first wife, but the fictional wife is Rivka Mendel. In April, Eliezer stands under the chuppah, that's the canopy, with Rivka Mendel. He had gone along with her wedding plans as if he had boarded a train, let it take him wherever it went. Excuse me. As they stand next to each other, she turns toward him, and for the first time he can remember, she looks full into his eyes and blinks at the sight of him, as if he had just been created out of clay. Standing this close to her, he thinks he catches a whiff of dried blood and faint rot. He looks away. Boi chala, come bride. He remembers how her father, who owned a tanning factory, had stank of his trade. Tells himself it's the memory of that stench in his nostrils, not something emanating from the actual flesh of this woman. Her eyes are gentle and liquid as a cow's, as if the spirits of those animals her father had stretched and beaten had lodged in his seed. Jewish funk, the Poles called that tanner stink. Next to Rivka Mendel, his old boxing manager, Benya, stands frowning and stern in a black coat and cylindrical cap, standing in for Eliezer mother and father. How would they have felt about this day, his marriage to this woman? He looks at her again, trying to see her through their eyes. Rivka Mendel, resplendent in smuggled black silk and pearls taken from the ships of Odessa. Beads of sweat necklace his bride. It's cold outside, but the packed bodies in the synagogue heat the air like the interior of a tanning shed. He knows who's being skinned. The tall arched window on the left wall of the building has been left open. Just outside, framed as if in a painting, he sees the white mare his friends in Bialystok are giving him as a wedding present. The mare had belonged to his friend Dove, gone now to America. Dove's sister, Rachel, is holding the horse's muzzle reins, glaring at him, it seems, in hatred. She tosses her cloud of black hair an instant before or an instant after, or the exact second the horse tosses her mane, black and white. Laser's eyes lock with hers. They've been seeing each other. She coming off into the horse market on 7th Street, saying she was there to visit this same horse. They had walked along the river. Once they had bathed in it, Rachel entering the water shyly from behind a bush where she'd undressed. The memory burned in his mind. The eyes that stare back at him are as wild as the mare's, and as Rachel tosses her head again, the horse, attuned to whatever was roiled in the girl's spirit, rears up, pulling her front hooves from the muck of mud and melting snow, breath steaming white flumes from the fiery red membranes of her flared nostrils. The Laser can't take his eyes off her. He thinks of her brother Dove, who had mutilated his foot with an axe to avoid being drafted, and then had rode away on another horse to avoid arrest. The chanting of the rabbi weaves with the whinny of the horse, the muscles under the animal's slick coat twitching as if the rabbi's words had turned into sharp-pointed Hebrew letters that poked under his skin. Laser felt the skin on his back and buttocks as if they were burning under his heavy gabardine. He becomes aware that everyone, the whole sweating, twitching mass of his people, pressed together, waiting to be skinned, is staring at him as he stares out the window at this girl, her eyes still accusing him. The rabbi bends and places a glass folded in cloth under Laser's right foot, thinking again of his friend who had cut off his toes to avoid being trapped. He shifts and stamps his foot down hard, but to the left of the glass, missing it, hearing the moan from the congregation, the crazed whinnying of the horse, all of the sounds pressing as if with strong fingers at his temples, and with the same sensation he knows Dove must have felt at the swing of the axe. Suddenly, as the swing of the axe suddenly released him from his fear, he leaps to the window. Looking back, he sees the people as if framed in a picture. Rivka Mendel's angry red face, the O of Benya's mouth. The congregation spills onto the steps of the synagogue. Men and women shouting at him, waving fists. He turns from them. What he sees now is Rachel's secret smile as he leaps onto the back of the mare. Her face is alight with triumph. Oy, chala, come, bride. He reaches down and she grasps his arm, her fingers tight around his wrists as he swings her up behind him. I guess that's not the same as a Mexican divorce, but it got them married in that way.
It's very cinematic. It's very romantic, I thought, to ride away on a horse.
That horse,
there's a lot of really
horse
cinematic
trading was, I'm sorry.
here.
Go ahead. I was going to say horse trading was one of the trades of the Jews in that town in Kolno.
Oh, sorry, can you say that again? It cut out for a sec.
I was just saying horse trading was one of the actual trades of the Jews in that town in Kolno.
Oh, gotcha.
So before I read the next section, which will be the last section I read, I'm going to show you some of the other pictures of. This was the town of Kolno when I went to visit it in the 90s, and okay, you can do the next slide. You see a lot. I mean, a lot of it looked the same as it probably did back in the days when our family was still there. This old type of housing, these wooden shingled roofs, etc. And the next one. This was the one on the left is a street along the market square. So one of those houses is where our immediate family had lived. And this boarded up building was the Jewish school. And it since that war, since the massacre of Jews, it had never been reopened and used again. Okay, next. This is what actually happened in the town. There's two parts that I'll read you about this. I should explain that the statue of Lenin was there because the Russian army had taken over. You know, the Germans and the Russians had divided Poland in 1939 with a treaty, and then in 1941 the Germans broke the treaty and took over that part of Poland. When the Russians were there, they had erected a statue of Lenin in the town. On the 4th of July, only 2 weeks after the occupation, this is the German occupation, the final events that marked the end of the Jewish community in Kolno began. When the Germans had first come to town, some of the Poles, seeking to gain favor, tried to demolish the statue of Lenin. On the 4th of Friday, the Polish police passed on an order from the Germans. All Jews in the town were to report to the former market square, craftsmen to bring their tools. Under German guns and whips, the Jews were forced to demolish the statue of Lenin with their tools, or with bare hands, and load the rubble into 2 carts, while, quote, the Poles stood there, men and women, old women and youths, their faces inflamed and excited, cursing loudly and making fun of the toiling and tortured Jews. Genopolsky Chudnowitz recounts how some Jews were given whips and told to lash others. If they beat too gently, they were lashed themselves. Several Jews were then harnessed to the carts and made to pull them, filled with the statue's rubble, to the Jewish cemetery, while others were forced to form a procession and sing and weep as if at a funeral. At the cemetery, they were made to dig a grave and bury the rubble. When Lenin's funeral was over, the Germans and Poles left the Jews standing in the cemetery. It was almost curfew time. Any Jew found on the street would be shot. So the people raced for their homes. There was no safety to be found, though. Whatever had been unleashed at the market square was now alive in the town. When darkness came, the Poles staged a pogrom, raping, robbing, murdering. Konopelski Chudnowitz recalls, my cousin Deborah Dudovitz, the Brismans, and the Dolowich family were among the victims. The 2 Dolowich daughters had been raped and then killed. 15 families were murdered that night. The next day, the Germans burned the Torahs and prayer books in the synagogue. In the following weeks, tormented the community with random shootings, beatings, forced labors, and decrees. Jews were to wear yellow patches. Jews can no longer walk on the pavements, only in the middle of the street. When it became too dangerous to go to synagogue, they prayed in the cellar of Gudalea's house. This is from the memorial book that's kept in the Holocaust Memorial, which has a book from each community that was destroyed in the Holocaust. You do the next slide. This was the synagogue. Again, after the war, it was never used again. It was bricked up or boarded up. I had this photograph of this window in the synagogue, which had our family name on it. And in that scene of the wedding, I have him looking out the window at Rachel, and so some of the windows were in that building. Okay, and the next. This is on the 15th of July. Konopelski Chudnowitz remembered the Germans commanded all the men aged 16 and above to gather in the market square and bring food for one day with them as they'd be going out to work. When they arrived, the men were loaded into and then driven away in 4 lorries to defensive trenches. Many of them must have helped dig. They were never seen again, though. After some days, the Poles were heard to say that the ground in the trenches had been seen shaking and trembling. 3 days later, the parents and wives and children of the murdered men were told to report to the market square with luggage and valuables. They were loaded onto the same trucks and driven to the nearby village of Meskasvoya near Saviks, where they were machine gunned into a mass grave. The third action took place at the end of July when all the remaining Jews were to the market square. From the descriptions, what happened must have been a combination of a Polish pogrom and the more orderly murder the Germans preferred. The Polish mob, eager to prove itself to the Germans, attacked the Jews gathered there. Babies were torn from their mothers' arms, their brains dashed out on the stones. People who tried to run away or resist were shot on the spot. The women and children were taken by lorry to Meshkavoye machine gun. The men were made to walk to Kolmagi and machine gun into ditches there. So I'm going to read this last part. And in the book, I try to create my parents' lives as if they, not just what happened in the Holocaust, but up to that period, into the 1930s and so on, and how that would have been living in that town. But then all these events, when the Russians came and then when the Germans came, and just before this part, which is called the Pisgah Forest, that was the name of the forest outside the town. I have the chapter about that riot in the market square, and then I have my parents trying to run away after they survived that, trying to run away into the forest. And this will be the last thing I read. I'll show you former pictures and then we can talk. The Pisgah Forest. They move into the tree line far enough so the sunrise will not reveal them. Gather and pile enough pine leaves to keep them off the forest floor. They lie down on the scratchy needles, looking at the stars between the tops of the trees. Sleep, rest for an hour or two, and then where? Eleazar reaches over and lays his hand on her belly. Mars, America, the moon. She waves at the trees, the forest. The Pisgah, she says. Yes, he says, the Pisgah. And I should say at this point, I imagine my mother being pregnant. It's too early for me, but I imagine her being pregnant with me at that point. So my dad also died of cancer, so I had also imagined that the father in the story has developed cancer. The path they follow is dimly lit in the moonlight that when Rachel first looks up, becomes sparkling silver coins as it breaks through the leaf canopy. Eleazar in front of her peers in and out of the shadows like an apparition. Their task, she realized, is hopeless. That is, it's based only on hope and desperation. The partisans, if they ever existed, could be anywhere. The Pisgah, America, the moon. Are you all right? Eleazar says. Daydreaming, she says. Stay awake, my love. At some point, they walk near the road that runs from Kolno to Zabrile, staying behind the curtain of trees fringing it. They freeze when they hear the rumble of a vehicle, see lights from the headlights of a large lorry illuminating the strip of concrete. Its bed is packed with people, pressed tightly together. Closer, she can see that they're all women and girls, all Jews. By sunrise, exhausted, they sit at the base of a huge pin oak and eat a little more of the bread and cheese. She sees Eleazar touch the scar on his nose, a gesture so familiar it brings her back to their home, brings a welling of grief at its loss. He touches his leg, gestures which she had only become acquainted with in the last months, his disease crowded out of her mind by the events of these last days. Is it painful? He moves his hand away quickly, as if she had caught him doing something shameful. It's nothing. She waves at the branches arched over their heads. At least it's summer, she says. Once when my brother was injured, my father dragged him on a sled through this forest during the dead of winter to a doctor he knew. A German, she added. Oh, yes, an educated people. We could have gotten away, she said. We could have gone to America. Our papa, like my papa wanted us to. I'm sorry, her husband says. She could bite her tongue. It had no bones. Even here, even now, it spoke her mother's bitter words. She wanted to swallow them, but they're already out in the world. You're right, her husband says. You could have gone with your brothers and sisters to America. I wrenched you from them. I wrenched you from who you were, who you could have been, because I needed you. You were so young, too young. Did he think she had no agency? She presses down her anger and sorrow, the anger and sorrow swelling in her heart. Anger and sorrow, and to her surprise, laughter. To hear such mundane lamentations here now, after all they had seen, all that still awaits them, all that had been lost. It referred to a normality that was as distant and abstract as the afterlife. What an insulting thing to say to me. Do you think you pulled me unwilling onto that horse? Cossack, she added. They grin at each other. He touches his leg. Well, now this is your burden. This is the heshbon, the bill. A thought comes into her mind. She spits it out before it can nest there. Do you believe Rivka Mendel cursed you? He laughs. She didn't give me cancer, nor did the Russians or the Germans come to avenge my insult to her. She's startled that he's finally named the disease. She had known they both must have felt that the last weeks had somehow negated that sickness, as if it was self-indulgent to admit to its progress. She feels a thickening of grief again in her throat, in her very womb. It's absurd. She knows they'll probably die anyway. Why does she have to suffer this as well? To know wherever they ran, an executioner ran with them, dwelt under her husband's skin. In the market square, at the cemetery, I tried to think of the Germans as Dybbks to explain them. Dybbks are demons that possess a person's soul. They were not Dybbks. They were Germans. I know. A sudden, mad staccato of drum beats assails her ears. It goes on and on. The trees around them seem to shiver, their leaves tremble. She remembers the lorry filled with women and children, driving in the direction of Zabeli, where she had helped dig anti-tank trenches. She looks at her husband. The sun is almost fully risen now, and his face is dappled with the light coming through the leaves woven above them. What if we'd gotten to Bremen, she asked. What if we'd taken a ship west instead of a train east? Saw the statue, the gleaming towers of the tall buildings waiting for us. That's all I meant. Her husband smiles. Rachel tries to imagine the golden streets and soaring towers of America, their spires piercing the clouds. But images from the market square and the cemetery, the whipped, the murdered, the raped, her friend Halima's troubled eyes, and Cherkensky's beautiful, ugly face crowds that dream from her mind's eye. The curses of the past they could have taken. Such stories have been negated, made ridiculous, rendered as unimportant as the cancer eating her husband's leg. There's no time for regret now, only for love. She touches her stomach. A laser, she says. We've never decided on what his name should be. I'd like to leave them there. Give them infinite possibilities, 1,000 paths to take through the woods. Run, I want to tell them. Look at them, those two, under those brooding trees, laced with shadows and sunlight. Look at them, called into the world by the words that have alighted, rallied beneath flesh, rallied breath and flesh into their forms. They are in the country of words. They can be cursive, printed, twisted, straightened, written right to left, left to right, horizontal or vertical. Anything can happen. Run, I want to shout at them. They can go anywhere. They can be betrayed, caught, tossed into a cart. And yes, a laser, the boxer getting his hands around their betrayer's neck, Rahel the fighter stabbing him, and they'll disappear into the forest, find the Jewish partisans, as their cousins Avraham, Dov, and Yitzhak Lebel did, fight valiantly, survive the war, immigrate, live for years before the cancer he refuses to see as a curse from the woman he abandoned creeps up my father's leg. Or they can disappear down another path, find a witch, magic dwarves that bring them to crystal caverns. Or Argumenta, the horse, resurrected, can come galloping out of the trees, and once and again they leap up on her broad back and ride away. But there's an obscenity about imagining from need, about fluidity. Didn't the Poles and the Germans imagine the Jews they needed, configured them from hate and longing and envy into forms so false and yet so true to their creator's nature that all they longed to do was bury them? I know what has to occur. And this is not a folk tale nor a fairy tale. This is about what happened and what didn't happen and what will keep happening. It is about loss that must be held up into the light so that it can speak to love.
Thank you for that. There's
I'll show
so
you a
much
few
there,
more.
so many. Okay, let's see.
Let me show you a few more slides, and then we can talk. Okay.
Okay.
This was the town square where that Lenin's funeral happened. There's no monument to it. I said there's no monument to it. That's a monument to the Soviet soldiers that liberated the town. And at the side of the square, I noticed that graffiti on that building, the word Slayer, which struck me at the time as ironic. Go ahead. That's what's in the cemetery, Jewish cemetery. What was left of the Jewish cemetery? It was one of the few stones that remained. They were kind of scattered throughout that grass, in that way.
Excuse me.
That's the area where my grandfather's grave is, where that cemetery was, with those few stones left standing. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
This is the list of names. One of the lists that I found with our family. And it struck me how the fate is always, very accurately, murdered. That's no euphemism. And, the list of the names. This was from Kolno. Next one is, this is from my grandmother's brother's family in the town of Jawabne that I mentioned. This was the next town, and the Jews in that town were locked into a barn and burned to death. Okay. So
just a quick follow-up to those slides. What year did you visit Kolno?
1993.
Do you know if the town looks the same today?
I think it's much more developed. Yeah, I mean, I'll have to Google this at some time, but I think it's much more developed at this point.
Yeah.
That was not long after the breakup, of the Soviet Union and everything else. So there's been a lot of changes.
So I have a question. So this will be the Q&A portion. We have about 10 minutes left of the reading. So if anyone in the audience has a question you want to put into the chat, feel free to do that. In the meantime, um, something that I wondered about throughout reading the book, I was wondering about sort of how writing this really brutal story affected you, sort of psychologically. Did you find that writing this was cathartic?
Uh, I don't know. I won't call it cathartic. I mean, for me, it was among the other things, other motivations I told you. It was a way for me to start writing again. Because I had gone through, both a personal loss, very deep personal loss, and between that and a sense of, just history, what was happening around me in the world and everything else. I came to a point where I really felt like the kind of writing I was doing was having no real effect on the world, and I questioned about why I keep writing this way and so on. So that that idea of the Genizah, for me personally, was also a kind of going into a darkness and opening up into writing again. So I don't know if you can call that cathartic, but that was,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah, when I first read the quote at the beginning of the book where you talk about um, stories can save lives, I think you talked about the many different possible interpretations of that, and I immediately thought that was a reference to saving your own life. You were talking about in the beginning how you thought of it as saving the lives, not literally, of course, but sort of saving the lives by sort of like telling the stories of those, in that town. Um, so I do you think there's some truth to that in terms of it
Yeah,
sort of saving your life as well?
yeah, there's both, uh,
Yeah.
all of that, sure.
Um,
And if it makes people think about their own families, and all of this, and make connections that you can save lives in that way too.
yeah.
Good,
Kim says, thank you, Wayne and Krista. You've made me want to start telling my stories.
good.
Yeah, it's funny enough. I a cousin of mine who does a lot of family history was visiting just this past weekend, and we went to the Southern Maryland Studies Center in the library at CSM, and we were able to listen to a oral history audio tape that was made. My great grandfather was interviewed in 1989 at the age of 96, and the
Mhm.
interviewer was asking him questions, about Hughesville in the 1800s. My great grandfather died. He died 5 years later at the age of 101. So I remembered him very well. So listening to his voice and having that archive, I found so moving, and it made me think so much about what a gift that is to have that oral history, to be able to hear his voice again, and
Yeah,
made me think so much about you and think about so many people don't have the ability to know so intimately their ancestors, and I grew up with my great grandfather living two doors down, and then even now, his voice is, living on that tape, in this library archived. And so this the last slide I showed, the list, that long list where you just see the repetition of the word murder, it just kind of hits you with each time
Yeah.
it's listed. It's like the lost opportunity, lost dreams, and um, it definitely made me think about my own family history, and sort of thinking about sort of
Yeah.
how our ancestors sort of you know the power of their stories, whether we sort of know them or not.
I did tape a lot of my mother's stories from her in her last years, which I recommend that to people. If you can get your parents or grandparents to sit down and record.
Mhm. You recorded the
Yeah.
conversation?
Yeah.
When did your mother pass away?
She passed away just before I went back to Poland, actually.
Oh, okay.
Couple of years before that, yeah.
My
Actually,
dad,
same year, I'm sorry, yeah.
same year. Did
Yeah,
she know
'cause,
you were going back?
I don't know how she would have felt about that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And well, how did she how to what extent did she talk about with before that conversation where you sat down with her to kind of like go over, did growing up, sounded
Yeah,
like she lived a pretty long life. Did she talk pretty regularly about her time in Poland?
and I don't know regularly, but she did, many times before it. I talked about it. So, yeah.
Um, did you do any research for this book, or did you sort of feel like this was just a story that was kind of living inside of you?
I did a lot of research. I mean, I had to recreate what it would have been like to live in that um, town, in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s. So I did a lot of research on that. I did a lot of research on um, other towns in Poland that had gone through the Holocaust. So yeah, there's quite a bit of research that went into it.
I had mentioned before, I thought it was so beautiful that in the fictionalized story of your parents, um, in the real story is that they both left Poland and met each other in New York City, whereas in this fictionalized version of their lives, they also meet and fall in love. And it felt like sort of like they were meant to be in both, and no matter which is like such a romantic notion, they were meant to be. And so the child in her womb at the end is like meant to be as well, and the child's meant to be you. And so at the end, I found myself really hoping that they made it out of the forest and that they were able to make it to America, that there was going to be some sort of turn where uh, I actually could see these people surviving, because this story had, I wanted so badly for them, um, you know,
Yeah,
to not, succumb to, to this war.
yeah.
Was there ever a play? Did you consider ending at all? Like,
No, I mean, as you could tell in the reading at that point, I mean, I really wanted them to survive. At that point, I was
yeah,
invested in them, just
uh,
like you did, which I'm hoping readers will. So yeah, I really wanted them to survive, but I thought that would have been um, phony. I mean, it would have made it into a fairy tale,
yeah,
and
yeah. Of
that's why
course,
I say that at the end. This is not a fairy tale,
exactly. Yeah,
you know. And if they stayed, they would have died.
yeah. It's almost like sort of turns it into like an alternate history. I thought of like Inglorious Bastards or something, where there's this happy ending that you
Yeah,
don't get, that well,
that's right.
I don't know if I'd call that a happy ending, but it's an alternative sort of ending, where
Yeah.
we're watching a historical event play out and then there's the twist. Um,
One of the reasons I hate that movie. Yeah.
yeah, I'm not a Tarantino fan in general, but
Yeah.
I teach film, and a student was writing about it, and I was like, okay, I'll watch it because it sounds interesting. But no, anyway. So at the end of the book, you say, it is also, I hope, a way to speak, to plead stop to all the hopeless cycles of murder that will always occur when we refuse to exercise the ability of our imaginations to inhabit the minds and lives of those on the other side of the pale, the fence, the borders between us. Can you talk a little bit about that quote?
Well, yeah, obviously, this isn't written in a vacuum. I mean, things are going on in the world.
Yeah.
And what I hope, it's what I talked about in the beginning with the writing. People are never going to think about the massacres that occurred in Israel, that are still occurring in Gaza, that that occurs, as far as I'm concerned, when there's that failure of imagination to put yourself into the consciousness of other people. And I don't have great hopes that fiction, doing that's going to change the whole world, but I wish it would. And I think that just to get into the habit of trying to view what this is, what the experience is of living for other people, makes it harder to kill them.
Yeah. And our class, we read The Lottery last week. We talked a lot about Stanley Milgram's experiments and the Stanford Prison Experiment, and sort of like how easy. Well, and we talked about scapegoating, and kind of how it's a really tough exercise to kind of ask ourselves, like, do I personally have any scapegoats? Is there anyone in the world that I can kind of see? Do I view any person or any group sort of as less than human? Have I ever celebrated the suffering of someone else, and why? And so I ask the students to kind of consider these questions in their hearts, not open for discussion, because I think that these are all questions that I think that like we're all sort of grappling with in our own personal way.
Yeah.
But there's another. Students say, thank you so much for taking the time to read to us today. It provided us with a lot of insight into the horrific events that occurred during this time period. Well, so I thank you so much for this, and thank you for everyone who came, and thanks for the questions. And I encourage anybody to buy the book. It is such a beautiful story. It is so lyrical. It is so poetic. The language is gorgeous, and I definitely think it's an incredible piece of work, and I thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I want to thank you. I want to thank College of Southern Maryland is always providing this forum. And for all of you who came today, I really, this is a rough reading.
Yeah.
These are not pleasant things. And I know I kind of put people through that. So I want to thank you for coming, and for listening, and for being here, all of you that did come today.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Bye, everyone. Take care.